Hello, and welcome to the Wandering Creatives podcast. I'm your host, Allie Poots, and joining me for today's episode is Hailey Shafir, and I am insanely excited to have you on the podcast. You have an amazing background, which I will let you describe and get into because I will completely botch it if I attempt to do it on my own. We're going to be chatting about imposter syndrome today, which I'm excited to get into because it's a thing that a lot of us creatives have, I don't want to say suffer from, but experience, I guess, is maybe a better way to say that. And you and I actually met at a market. So not only are you like this amazing, like counselor, therapist, badass, but you're also a creative, which I think gives you a lot of amazing insight into kind of how our brains work. I'm going to let you jump in and tell us a little bit about yourself and about your mental health background and how you got into it.
Yes. Well, Allie, thank you so much for letting me come on your podcast today. I've been really excited about it, really looking forward to it. Creativity has been such a central part of my life, but in recent years has also been a central part of the professional work that I'm doing, even in the field of counseling, and then also just working with my clients on it, because I've started to realize how central creativity is to all aspects of mental health and well-being, which I'm hoping that, in the future, we could maybe dedicate an entire podcast to that. But to give your listeners a little bit of an intro on me. My name is Hailey Shafir. I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor, a licensed clinical addiction specialist, and a certified clinical supervisor. All that is to say that I have a master's degree in mental health counseling, and I've spent over a decade of my career working in different facets and aspects of mental health and addiction treatment. So for a long time, I was a counselor, and then I was also a clinical director and a supervisor. And then in 2017, I sort of made a little bit of like a shift in my career trajectory. I quit what was by all measures a very secure, stable salary position as a clinical director. And I sort of, just kind of went off on my own. I had a small business already where I developed these treatment planning cards for therapists called Planet Therapy Cards. They were somewhat successful, but they definitely did not pay the bills. And so I was sort of in this weird space where I had to redefine my career again. In doing that, I stumbled across an original love of mine, which is writing. And so I forayed back into, the field of writing, but instead of doing creative writing, I was doing professional writing as a therapist and as an addiction specialist. So since 2017, I've really built up that business a lot. I've written hundreds of articles on mental health and addiction. That's one of my primary income sources right now. In addition, I also do some therapy through my practice Keep Counsel. I'm a clinical supervisor for newly licensed counselors and do a lot of trainings for counselors. And then recently, and this is how I met Allie, I started another business called Indie Wind. And that was really just kind of like a little passion project for me. It hadn't, I think it does have to do with mental health, but it really was just a business where I could create different forms of art. So I make these silk wrap skirts and I make orgonite pyramids and different things like that, little fairy garden terrariums that are meant to be like little 3D vision boards that help people to manifest the things that they want in their life. And really, it was just for fun. It was a way of me, I guess, monetizing one of my hobbies so that I could better justify the amount of time I spent doing that instead of quote unquote real work. And I'm glad I did. And especially because I got to meet some really cool people, and Allie being one of them. We were set up right next to each other at this first market, and I was struggling trying to set up my tent. And she was like really gracious and really kind about not judging me for, sweating and looking like a complete amateur.
Please. I'm sure. I love that about markets though, is like, we're all there to like help each other and there's no judgment. I like to think that anyways, because if people saw me setting up, they would turn and run because my face gets like purple.
Right. Right. So that's
Oh
how I
my
met
gosh.
Allie. I was sweating and trying to set up my tent and it wasn't working. And I was infringing upon her space in a major way, probably scaring away customers. And she was still very nice to me. So I appreciated that.
Always. Yeah. And that was really cool for me too, because I got to see like your fairy gardens are just adorable. They're kind of like terrariums, but with resin, and I don't know. I love them. Yes. And so I got to sit there and look at your amazing resin artwork. And then you and I actually had a resin night. I came over and you taught me how to do resin, which I'm totally obsessed with now. And
welcome.
Oh my God. It's so much easier than you think it would be.
Absolutely. And it is very addictive little pastime and very messy. Very messy.
Oh my gosh. So messy. So messy. And while I was over kind of playing with the resin, you and I were chatting, and I mentioned that I don't think I'd started the podcast yet, but I think I mentioned it while we were crafting. And then recently we were talking and I was like, I'm starting to notice patterns in the people that I'm interviewing. And one of them is imposter syndrome. Like a lot of the people, the creatives that I'm talking to, find that they are experiencing imposter syndrome or they know someone who has. And so I kind of mentioned that to you because I was like, oh, I know someone who's like extremely smart and knows therapy and things about the brain. I was like, I'm going to talk to Hailey about it. And so we decided to do an episode about it. And again, so excited for today's episode where you'll be taking us through like the different levels of imposter syndrome and how we can manage it as creatives. So I'm excited to jump into that.
This episode of the Wandering Creatives podcast is sponsored by Coots Creations, branding and marketing for creatives by creatives. Coots Creations serves small businesses, entrepreneurs, and creatives throughout the country with branding, marketing, and social media management. We accomplish this by creating unique graphics, a cohesive visual brand, and content that tells your brand's story and builds trust with your customers. Visit cootscreations.com and book your free consultation today.
To start with, can you explain a little bit about what imposter syndrome is? Like, is that the actual term for what we're experiencing, or is that just kind of like a layman's term that we all know and use?
Yeah, good question. So imposter syndrome is also known as like a fraud complex or sometimes as imposterism. But yes, it is a well-known and well-documented phenomenon in the field of psychology and mental health. It is not a diagnosable condition. So it's not like you would go and see a counselor and they would, formally diagnose you with that and be billing your insurance for imposter syndrome, right? Mm-hmm. It's often attached to diagnoses like anxiety or depression or something like that. But that doesn't make it less real. In fact, I would say that, out of the many different issues that I encounter as both a counselor who works directly with clients and also as a clinical supervisor who's working with newly licensed counselors who are working to get their full licensure, imposter syndrome is something that I would estimate definitely over half, maybe even close to 60 to 70% of people struggle with in some way or another. And really, I want to make an important just sort of like disclaimer as we go into this topic is that while there is some research on imposter syndrome, there is not enough research to really pin down specific definable terms and concepts as absolutes. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about today is stuff that Allie, you and I had kind of fleshed out when we were planning this episode. Also things that I've encountered and just sort of these themes that have emerged in people who struggle with imposter syndrome. So generally defined, imposter syndrome, I believe, is just a certain, I like to call it like a brand of shame. So shame being the almost universal emotional experience of feeling inadequate or not good enough in some way, or just not enough in some way. Now we can fill in the blanks, not smart enough, not successful enough, not creative enough, whatever it is. But essentially, when we reduce that down, we get that in simplest form. It's this experience of not feeling like we are enough. So the feeling of being unworthy or inadequate in some area or way in our life. And there's also this social element to shame and imposter syndrome, where not only do we have this insecurity or these feelings of inadequacy, but combined with that, we also are then really, really terrified that other people are going to notice this and maybe call it out in us. So it's, not only do I feel like I'm not good enough, right? I feel incompetent or I don't know what I'm doing, but now I'm also terrified that other people are going to see that in me too. And that, what is that going to mean for me, my life, my work, my future, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that social shame aspect, it feeds into like, you're putting yourself out there and you're just like, what if I'm not good enough? What if they can tell that I think I'm not good enough, which means they think that, and it like influences how they see me as an artist.
Right. So I guess the difference would be between your garden variety, quote unquote, shame, and then imposter syndrome would be that imposter. If you think about the word imposter or the word fraud, that there's like a performance aspect of that. Mm-hmm. So while shame might be like, oh, well, I'm not pretty enough, or, I'm not lovable enough. Imposter syndrome is, as a brand of shame, is much more tied to some kind of like area of life where we feel like we don't have the knowledge or the skills or the competence to do a certain task or to fulfill a certain role or obligation or responsibility, which is why imposter syndrome so often shows up in these vocational areas of life. For instance, it might show up in college if we feel like, as I felt like when I got into college, being, sort of a person that, was kicked out of high school and really rebellious and all this. I got into college and I was terrified that they let me in by accident.
Yeah.
As soon as they found out that I wasn't actually smart enough to be there, they would kick me out. So what did that look like for me? Well, that meant that I didn't raise my hand in class and I tried to fly under the radar. And I literally spent, years just kind of shrinking and hiding because I was terrified that I would be found out, quote unquote, or exposed as a fraud. And that once I did, I would get kicked out and it would all fall apart. And this whole, mistake, what I thought was a mistake of letting me into this college, which we're not even talking about some Ivy League college here. We're talking about your run-of-the-mill state university. I was convinced that would just be the end of it for me. And I feel like, that's what artists experience, maybe just in a different way with their art.
Yeah, 100% know exactly what you're talking about and have experienced the same thing, especially with school. We won't go into that. So when it comes to artists and creatives, how would you say that typically imposter syndrome would present itself in a creative?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that there are a number of different ways that imposter syndrome can sort of show up differently for someone who is an artistic or a creative or in this whole realm where what we're doing is we're making things for a living. And I think that because we're making things for a living, especially those of us who have kind of monetized, our art, then it adds this other element where it's like, it's different than, I don't know, getting a job at Google or being assigned a certain, role or task to build a website according to certain specifications for someone else. When we work for someone else and we're creating something for someone else according to a pre-designed template or a role or a job description, then I feel like because that involves less creativity and autonomous choice about what we're actually doing and how we're doing it, that kind of lessens imposter syndrome. But when you put us into a sphere where we are literally have 100% creative control over what it is that we make, then that's when imposter syndrome, which is a very opportunistic sort of, not disorder, but issue, tends to crop up most, because now it's completely up to me, which means it's completely on me if it's terrible and everyone hates it and no one likes it and it bombs, right? I have no one to blame. It's not like I can point at, my boss and be like, oh, well, that was a terrible idea, or point at like all these different restrictions I had on what I was doing and say, well, I couldn't really do what I wanted because of this, this, and this. As an artist, so having so much free reign and having so much creative autonomy also means that we have a lot more that we can potentially blame ourselves for. There's a lot more room for failure and a lot less places where we can project that failure and blame outward.
And we had kind of discussed there are scenarios, I guess I'll call them, where imposter syndrome can potentially pop up in a creative's life, I guess, or in their business cycle. Can you walk us through those kind of 5 scenarios and how imposter syndrome might present itself?
Absolutely. This was actually something that Ali, you and I had sort of fleshed out just in our planning session. So again, this is not something that, we can find in the research or in some book somewhere. This really just came from Ali and I kind of brainstorming it out and thinking about it as creatives. And I think Ali has a lot of amazing insight too, just because you've done this podcast and you've interviewed so many creative people. But the first one that we sort of outlined was kind of like that first step where you're basically have made the decision to take what was a hobby and now turn it into a business. Right. So that would be the first kind of like transition or segue point where the opportunist of imposter syndrome is very likely to pop up for certain people, because essentially what you're doing is you're taking something that, was just for you. And maybe you shared it with, your friends and family and people that you trusted, or maybe you even had a little tiny, Instagram feed or following that you posted it on, but it was still really just for you. And now you've made the decision to kind of brand it and put it into the world and also to monetize it, which that's a really big step, right? That means that, you inherently are saying that your art has like some kind of value, not just for you and not just as a creative hobby, but also has a potential to be something that other people would like and would like enough to actually spend money on, right? And that's why that can be such a paralyzing and crippling kind of moment for people. And it might set in, might not set in like just right in the moment when you decide that like, oh, I'm going to make this a business. It might be like literally you're making your logo, or you're putting the finishing touches on your website, or you set up your first craft show and your tent's not working, right? And you have
this panic.
You're like, oh my God, I shouldn't be here. I don't belong here. I don't know if I can do this. And that's kind of maybe where it can show up for the first time. Can you speak to that at all for yourself or people you've talked to?
Yeah. And I think I think there's also that experience of taking that thing, like you said, like maybe it's just a hobby, right? You're just doing it for fun or because you love it so much. And then you're taking that thing that you love and you enjoy, and you're like, I hope others will love and enjoy it as much as I do, which means that they'll spend money on it. And so there's that potential of like, you're like sharing a little piece of yourself with others. And so there's that fear, I think, of rejection as well that feeds into that, imposter that's hanging out on your shoulder telling you that you're not good enough and people aren't going to like your items. So I think that all feeds into that experience of, am I good enough? Can they tell that I'm faking? And I say that in like quotations, my ability to paint or my ability to make resin. Like I'm not a professional. And so personally, like I have a lot of those thoughts, not just with like art, but in writing, in, everyday life.
Right.
So I think, that fear that someone won't love the thing you're making as much as you do is a part of it as well.
Or won't love it enough to pay for it, or won't look at it and say it's worth that. Mm-hmm. Like it was the same thing that I hear my supervisees talk about, and oftentimes they're new graduates. So many of them, maybe they were counseling for free at like the NC State Counseling Center. So they weren't charging at all, right? Mm-hmm. For their therapy that they were providing. And then when they graduate and they get their license and they get their first job, now all of a sudden they find out that people are paying $100 or $120 per session to see them. And that's a moment when they experience imposter syndrome too. Yeah. Or like in a moment where like, I decided to get unpaneled with certain insurances just because the reimbursement and the administrative headache was so terrible. But like that meant that some of my clients went from paying a $25 copay to paying $150, which is a full fee, right? Yeah. And in that moment, I had a little bit of that imposter syndrome where it was like, oh, wow, are people actually going to think that my time is worth that much?
Yeah.
I think it's the same thing with your art too. It's different when you give it away for free and you're like giving it to your friends and your family.
Yes. And also the like the monetary aspect of it, definitely. Like you mentioned that shame feeling, and like I associate shame with like guilt, like they kind of feed into each other. And so I think there's also a little bit of like, for me personally, there's like guilt about charging people money because of how I grew up and, not having a lot of finances. And there's a huge part of me that wants to make creativity and art accessible and affordable to everyone. And so asking people to pay for it there's that guilt, that shame also that feeds into it. And I think that's why a lot of creatives have problems with pricing stuff. Like it's so hard for me to sit there and go, oh, I'm going to charge $30 for like a 13 by 19 print, which I could charge probably twice that amount if I wanted to, but like $30 to me, I'm like, that's a lot of money for like art print. You know what I mean? So there's
I was wandering around. I'm in Playa del Carmen right now. I was wandering around on Fifth Avenue, which is like this major street last night. And I found this painting and I was like, this painting is so cool. And I went to the gallery owner and I was like, how much is it? And she gave me some ridiculous number because the exchange rate. So I'm like trying to bust out math in my head. That painting was $20,000 US.
Oh, wow.
I was thinking to myself, okay, well, number one, obviously I'm not buying that painting, right? Yeah. But yeah, I get it, right? Like we want it to be affordable and accessible. It's the same with therapy too, but we also have to understand that that's not just all guilt about people not being able to afford it. Some of it is actually shame about not feeling like what we are creating or offering is actually worth paying that amount of money. But then if you think about, okay, well, I charge $150 per therapy session. Think about all of the things that people buy for $150, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've all made $150 purchase and then been like, oh, this is terrible, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I like to think that like when I put it into the grander perspective of things that I can sort of reframe it that way. But yes, I think you're absolutely right. The monetization is a huge, huge barrier. And the second one that kind of segues into it is that launch moment.
Mm-hmm.
So the moment when, you set up your business and you're actually going public. This might be the moment, when you have your first craft show, or when you actually go to, maybe like your work is in a gallery. So it's opening night and you have your paintings up. Right? Or it might be when you actually launch your website and go live with your social media. And that moment of like almost the mini version of the IPO for the creative, when we're putting our business out there and we're putting our art out there, and it's the real launch, which sometimes that can happen like a little bit of a delayed thing, right? Because I don't know, we might set up our business and have this tiny social media feed. So the real launch might feel like it's when we do go to that first craft show, right? Even though we launched our business maybe a couple months ago. But that moment of the going public, and there might be more than one of them, is oftentimes another moment where we have that imposter syndrome crop up for us.
Yeah. And also just calling yourself a business owner. It's another one of those, one of those things like are people going to see me as a business owner or believe that I'm a business owner when I tell them that I have a business, like all of that. I mean, it just messes with their mind. Like it's the same thing about saying like, I still have a hard time calling myself a writer because in my mind, I write, yes. And I've published things, but I've not published with like in the traditional way. So therefore I am an imposter. And people will find out. So it's hard for me to call myself a writer because of that. I think it's kind of the same thing with putting titles.
Well, but that's the thing is that you cannot, and this is like a really important point about imposter syndrome, is that we often have these certain conditions or these reasons or excuses or justifications about why we're an imposter. So for you, I'm not a real writer because I haven't been published by X, Y, and Z. But even though I've written hundreds of articles, well, I could say that I'm not a real writer because I haven't published a book, or because even when I do publish a book, because I haven't published a best-selling book, or because I got published by this random independent small publisher, right? So there's always going to be a moving goalpost. Imposter syndrome, we believe it's something that we can achieve or perform our way out of. I mean, I meet with people who are my clients who are literally, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies who have launched their own startups. And, we're talking about multi-millionaires who have been wildly successful by any external measure. Mm-hmm. And actually, they might have more imposter syndrome than you or I. And so it's really good to know that while you create these goalposts in your mind of like, oh, well, I'll be a real writer if or when, or I'll be a real artist if or when, and I won't feel like a fraud then, you just move the goalpost every time.
Yeah. So that makes me wonder, because I was going to ask like, how much of imposter syndrome do you think is because of like societal expectations or like norms that are set for us? And how much of it do you think is just, like you said, kind of like our internal goals setting that we're just like constantly moving? Or do you think it's a mix of both?
I think it could be a mix of both. I mean, I think that we first our inner critic, if you want to call it that, like we learn that critic from somewhere, right? And so oftentimes it's modeled after the original critics in our life, which were often, by the way, well-intentioned people who really cared about us and really wanted to push us and help us to succeed, but maybe weren't always the most encouraging, right? And so we developed this inner critic and we kind of learned some of those behaviors. And I think that at some point it just does become an internalization of, external critics or of even societal standards or what I call templates of like what success is supposed to look like or what the traditional path to being successful is supposed to look like. For instance, it's such a cliche, but to think about, how many people at some point go to their parent and say something like, I really want to go to college and major in music or art or creative writing. And then they're told, well, that's not really realistic, right?
And you can't make a living doing that.
You can't, right. And then like you and I had talked about this whole concept of the struggling or starving artist. Mm-hmm. Do we know of another career where we put starving in front of it? We couldn't think of one.
No.
So that's so culturally ingrained. Like that messaging kind of connotates that in order to be an artist and do this creative thing that you really love, that means you're always going to be broke, right? And you're always going to struggle and starve. Well, that's pretty like toxic messaging.
Yeah, and just ingrained in us. Oh yeah. So the third scenario is the sneaky imposter, which is, I enjoyed the name very much.
Yeah. They're all sneaky, but the sneaky imposter scenario is essentially the one that really just does kind of sneaks up on you. And it can happen at just like this weird moment where it's almost like, in addiction therapy, we talk about rock bottom, and we talk about this concept of rock bottom. And most people think about hitting rock bottom as like this moment where like, your entire life falls apart. So you like get a DUI or your wife leaves you or something terrible happens. But rock bottom isn't always like that. Sometimes it's just a moment where you kind of catch like a glimpse of yourself in the mirror and you say, oh my God, is that me? Or, oh, am I really doing this? And so the sneaky imposter is like the mirror, the reflective surface where we see ourselves actually doing this whole artist thing. And it could be a moment when we're actually like doing it well. Like we're actually like selling a lot at this art show, or someone just bought one of our paintings for $20,000. I hope that there's some listeners out there that have had that experience.
That'd be amazing.
Right. But it's the sneaky imposter is usually comes up when there's some kind of evolution or growth or progress that is happening in our career as an artist or in our art. And it could even be just like a compliment that we get, or someone comes up and they're like, I love your work. And right. And so the sneaky imposter can show up. It can show up, sure, during times of failure, like the rock bottom, like crash and burn, right? Something like really doesn't go well. We bomb at one of our art shows. No one likes it. The critics tear us a new one. But it can also show up when we're successful. And that's something that a lot of people do not really realize is that, and I think that Liz Gilbert did a really great TED talk on this when she talked about the experience she had after she wrote Eat, Pray, Love, which was a best-selling book that I never read. But she basically talked about how she spent her entire career as a struggling, starving artist. And that's how she identified herself.
Of course.
Waited tables and she got rejection letters. And that just was kind of like her norm, used to getting rejection letters. And then all of a sudden she wrote Eat, Pray, Love. And it was like what felt like an overnight best-selling sensation. And she said that freaked her out more than any of her previous failures. Failure had become a little bit comfortable and normal and familiar to her. But when she wrote Eat, Pray, Love, and it was wildly successful, she experienced imposter syndrome like she had never experienced it before. And she said that after that, she had writer's block for the first time in her life because she was thinking to herself, how can I ever top that? Mm-hmm. Now the whole world is watching and I'm going to fail epically. And not only is my little tiny circle of people or this little tiny review board that's going to send me a rejection letter going to notice that I'm an imposter, but now the whole world is going to notice I'm an imposter, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but it fits perfectly though, that when you have that, like that success, it kind of amps up a little bit. And that actually feeds into the role shift because you're stepping up, right? You're going to the next level in your business or your job. And it's the perfect opportunity for imposter syndrome to show up. And that's, I've definitely experienced the role shift many a time where I've had to build teams or lead teams. And I'm constantly questioning, like, am I qualified enough to be doing this? Like, everyone on the team will have years more experience than I have or higher education than I have. And so I'm like, who am I to be like building a team of these people? So I've definitely experienced the role shift, imposter syndrome quite a bit, especially in my corporate days, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the fourth transition or the fourth opportunity for the imposter to sort of come and sit on our shoulder or knock on our door, is that moment of expansion where something about our business or our role in our business is shifting and expanding and growing and changing. So this could be when, maybe we are at a point where we hire a new employee, or we have enough money to hire an assistant or get a real quote unquote studio space instead of like a shared workspace. Or it could also be a moment when, maybe like for me, when I went from being a counselor to being a supervisor, because now I'm teaching other counselors how to counsel. And while I might feel confident in my ability to counsel people, maybe I don't feel like I'm in any position to teach other people how to do it, right?
Well, and also, I don't know, but I would think too that in a profession where you are teaching others to take care of others, there's that extra added like layer, because you're like, I need to help them so they can help others. Like, no thanks. The stress and anxiety associated with that I could not do it.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, you're giving me anxiety now. So now yeah. But it could happen maybe if you have a small studio and let's say that you open up and you start doing classes or tutorials, or you start a YouTube channel and you're trying to teach other people how to do it. Any kind of role shift, or it could also be a moment where maybe you need to kind of step out and do something a little bit less comfortable for you. So maybe as a creative, you find yourself having to go and do a pitch or a presentation to try and get a new commission or a contract. That could be a role shift that could be really uncomfortable for you. And that could be a moment when your imposter syndrome really shows up, because now you're in a room full of all these executives and you're having to essentially prove yourself, or you feel like you have to prove yourself. So yeah, the moment of expansion is definitely a moment when the imposter syndrome can show up. And then the last one, which we kind of already touched on, but maybe bears repeating, is just that whole idea that failure and success, which we're going to experience both at some point in a full and enriched career. Mm-hmm. As an artist, are inevitables, right? It's inevitable that we're going to fail and that we're going to succeed at some point if we do what we do long enough. So both of those can be massive triggers for imposter syndrome. But like I said, I think that success might actually be more of a trigger than failure. Because at least with failure, it's like, oh, well, this is comfortable. This is familiar. This is what I expected. I've already war gamed, out the worst case scenario, right? But I usually don't war game out the best case scenario.
Yeah.
So now I'm like really unprepared for that. Now I'm also like, oh my God, I just raised the bar for myself. And now everyone has these really high expectations of me. And I have all these ways of thinking to myself, well, this is just like a one-off. That didn't count. I got lucky. I had help, right? We have all these ways of discrediting our success.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas with our failure, we're much more likely to internalize that and be like, well, of course I failed. I'm a terrible artist. I don't know what I'm doing. I have no talent, and that whole kind of idea of like, either way, I like the way that Liz Gilbert says it in that TED Talk, is that both success and failure, they catapult you equal distances from your comfort zone. And what happens is that if you think about it, like it's like one of those like line charts, right? then if you're just like, if 0 is the resting point and failure is like -10 and success is like +10, well, the absolute value of each is 10, meaning they're 10 like points away from your baseline or your normal or what's comfortable or familiar for you. So they're both like equally disorienting to you. And you're like, oh my God, where am I? What am I doing? How did I get here? How do I get back over there where I'm comfortable? And either one. But I think that when you're at the +10, because you've been really, really successful, you feel it even more because you're like, oh God, now I've set this bar for myself. Everyone's watching. Everyone's expecting more from me. Whereas if you're at -10, you're like, oh, well, at least I can just shrink and hide. And like, everyone expects me to fail. So it's really low bar.
Yeah. Low expectations, definitely. And also I think it's easier for some, I'll say it's probably easier to tap into that negative self-talk and less so about positive self-talk.
Right.
I don't know if others have experienced this, but it's easier for me to look at like the negative stuff than to sit down and say like, okay, like what am I grateful for? What is going well in my life? And so I imagine that feeds into it a little bit as well, kind of having that ability to negative self-talk comes easier than the positive.
Right.
Do you know what goes great with listening to podcasts? If you said a warm drink, you're absolutely right. Just imagine you're sitting back, you're listening to your favorite podcast, all while holding a nice, cute-ass mug in your hand with your favorite hot beverage in it. If you're wondering, where can I get a mug like that? Well, you're in luck. You can swing by the Coots Creations Cute Coffee and Tea Mugs Etsy shop. They've got everything from enamel coffee cups to travel mugs, all featuring adorable original artwork. Head over to etsy.com/shop/Coots Creations and use promo code WANDER for 10% off any mug.
So we just went through like the 5 scenarios of imposter syndrome. And so now what are some of the impacts or effects of imposter syndrome that some creatives or individuals may experience?
Well, I think that there's many, and I think that it can show up a little bit differently for every person. And it probably, like I said, imposter syndrome or the frog complex is very opportunistic. So it's always going to try and like prey or capitalize on your existing insecurities, right? If you're a person who, really struggles with social anxiety or depression or has a lot of maybe performance anxiety, then those are going to be the ways that it's going to show up the most. But I will say that overall, like anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, lack of confidence, not trusting yourself, playing it safe and staying in your comfort zone rather than kind of pushing yourself to that next level are some of the more common ways that it can impact you. And those can be incredibly self-limiting. We don't really realize, but we are constantly being limited by our old fears and our old insecurities. Those include things like, I call them like the invisible fences, that they're these like invisible electric fences that were like the underground electric fences that maybe when we were young, we were teased or bullied, or maybe we remember going to a craft show and it went really bad, or someone was like, oh my God, they're charging $20 for that. Who would pay that? Well, that's an example of like one of the times where we got shocked. And unknowingly, what can happen is that the trauma of that can stay with us. And so we maybe after that, we lowered our price to $15 and we said, I'm never going to go above that because I never want to have that experience again. We assumed if we did go up to $20 or $21 or $25 for this item, that same thing would happen again, that we would be shocked. So we never retested that boundary. And that can be incredibly limiting, for us in our artistic career. Or, for someone like you who has made this invisible fence or this storyline that you're not a real writer, right? Well, think about all the ways that that's become an invisible fence that you have just unknowingly operated inside of, right? Think about if that fence wasn't there, you might have already started a blog or applied to different writing contracts or put your writing out there in different ways. But because you have that self-limiting story, you don't realize it, but you're holding yourself back and restricting yourself. Mm-hmm. And we do that a lot. And so I'd really just, encourage people to think about what are some of those old things that you have told yourself about who you are, the kind of artist you are, how good you are, where your talent comes from, right? Whether you're a natural talent and then you're, you're self-taught. So you're really insecure about not having a formal education or the Juilliard sort of Ivy League art path, or whether you are the Juilliard person and you're oh, well, I'm not a real artist because I have no natural talent. I just, had all this formal training. Either way, both groups are going to look at the other and feel insecure, right? Mm-hmm. And so that can also kind of create this divide within the creative community where we start to sort of develop this unknowing rivalry, but it's really based on our own insecurity. Mm-hmm. We don't want to hang out with the person. If I'm a self-taught artist, I don't want to hang out with the Juilliard person because they make me feel bad about myself. Right. And the Juilliard person might not want to hang out with me because they think, oh my God, she's got all this natural talent. Right. And so now we've created a divide within our community. Instead of banding together, we're sort of pitting ourselves apart. So that's a major disservice, I think, in terms of one of the impacts. And then the final impact that I'll say is that the performance anxiety can be crippling. Yeah. When we start thinking too much about, being an imposter or being a fraud or a fake, and then we start worrying about what other people are going to think about our art, then we can get in our head and it can actually change our art. And now we're making it for other people instead of making it for ourselves. So we're much more likely to make a replica or an imitation of someone else's art instead of making something authentic to us. Mm-hmm. And we're also more likely to just kind of self-sabotage in a way, right? Our own artistic form. And we do it, it's largely unconscious, but it's very much driven by shame, insecurity, and imposter syndrome.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So now that we've laid it out, right? We've kind of we've taken a deep dive into imposter syndrome. And so now we want to make sure that we're also providing some tips on how to kind of manage imposter syndrome now that we know a little bit more about it. So what are some steps that creatives can take to kind of help deal with those feelings of shame and that they're not, good enough?
Yeah. So, if we were to just kind of give some takeaways, right? So a few short takeaways about what you can do to work on overcoming imposter syndrome. And really, when I say overcome, I don't really mean overcome because it's kind of like a spiral staircase. You're going to keep on meeting the same imposter just at different levels. And you'll think to yourself, oh, am I at the same spot? But it's a spiral staircase. No, you're not. You're not going backwards. You're not at the same spot. You're meeting it at the next level. So don't expect to completely overcome it. Expect to re-encounter it. But know that when you do, you are encountering it at a different level. You have more skills, more knowledge, more experience, all of that. The first thing that I would say is that it's really important to understand that this imposter syndrome, if you thought about it like it was a part of you, that ultimately it's really easy to demonize it as this evil part of you, this malignant part of you that you need to get rid of, that you need to completely kill off in order to, strive and move forward. It's not. So the very first thing that you need to do is change the way you think about your inner imposter. Your inner imposter, we could kind of say, is synonymous with your inner critic. Now, what does your inner critic ultimately want for you? And why is it so hard on you? Well, just like the original critic in your life that might have been your overbearing mom or dad or teacher or whoever, this critic, this imposter part of you is ultimately wants you to succeed. And so understanding that it wants you to be successful, and it just isn't really like the best at always knowing how to help you be successful, I think is really important. Because once you do that, then you understand that it's not really about having to fight your imposter. It's about having to understand that it cares about you, it cares about your success, and you can just sort of like, pat it on the back like you would with your overbearing mom and say, yes, mom, I know you're worried. I know you love me, and you're just doing this because you're concerned. It's going to be okay, right? It allows you to change your interaction with that part of you. And then the second step that I would say is that you want to be really, really careful about what conversations you engage in with your inner critic, right? So what I mean by that are like there's a running dialogue or back and forth in your head all the time. Now, if you were to be at work, like in a traditional office setting, which I know a lot of us don't work in traditional office settings, but let's just go with it for a second. If we were to be at work and we walked into like maybe the break room and there was two of our colleagues that were having a nasty, mean, gossipy conversation about another coworker, right? What would we do? Would we stand there and participate in it, or would we just kind of like leave? I would leave, right?
Yeah.
I would be like, I don't want to be a part of this. Like, I'm not going to stand here and like hate on this person. This is me, right?
In the negative.
So, yeah, when you hear the mean, gossipy critic in your mind talking about you that way, imagine yourself disengaging and walking away. Like, you just walk away. And how do you do that? Well, you're not physically walking away. You can imagine that in your mind, but you are just refocusing your attention. You would be walking away in the office to probably go back to your own office and not get real work done. So whatever it is, the real work that needs to be done in that moment, get back to that, right? So less gossip. And then the third one that I would say is that you want to do some reframing. Now, reframing comes from cognitive behavioral therapy, which I'm not a huge fan of, but it does have some utility. And it's essentially just, how do I rethink my thoughts in more helpful ways? The reframe for a lot of the anxious kinds of thoughts or the self-critical thoughts are a lot of times they show up in terms of what if ... right? So like, what if I fail? What if no one likes it? What if no one buys it? What if blah, 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 right?
Yeah.
We want to turn the what if thoughts into even if thoughts. So even if no one buys anything, even if people don't like it, even if someone makes a snarky comment, right? Mm-hmm. And when we do that, we actually are taking a lot of power away because we don't realize that ellipsis, that ... has a lot of like dread and like anticipation to it, right? But as soon as we say even if, and we actually fill in the blank, then we realize, yeah, it wouldn't be so bad. And we also prepare ourselves to come up with some kind of plan of what we would do if that quote unquote worst case scenario were to happen.
Yeah.
The fourth one that I would say is really, really important is going back to this whole idea, really like almost like Liz Gilbert in that TED Talk, what she talks about, how did she get over that whole like crippling writer's block and imposter syndrome she experienced after she wrote the best-selling book? Well, she describes it as she went home, she came back home, writing is my home, right? Which essentially just means that she put her head down, she blocked out the noise of the external world, and she started writing just for herself again. Instead of writing for the audience, quote unquote, the very large audience that she had to sort of block the audience out. So I would say, like, just like they say, like in performance anxiety, when you pretend that it's an empty auditorium or something, right? Like you literally block out the all of the audience and the public perception, and you just start making your art for you again, right? That's really important.
I have a question around this. And I almost asked that earlier, but I'm wondering because I feel like a lot of us, I guess I'll just use myself again as an example, right? Like I make stickers. And so I was out there with the stickers, nothing selling. So I'm like, okay, do I need to do something with the price? Is my art not good enough? Or is it just not what the people want? And so then the question becomes, do I need to make what the people want just in order to make money and survive as an artist, right? Because we're all struggling and starving. And so I wonder how that works into all of this. Like what if you're forced, I guess, because of circumstances to change your art and what you're making or whatever you're writing, does that feed the imposter syndrome? Or I don't know. I'm just curious about how that like feeds into the whole thing.
I would say I do a lot of writing, but I have to write according to like specifications. I don't always get to pick my own topics, and I have to sometimes include keywords, and some of them I think are kind of dumb, because they're like SEO terms. And I'm like, really, this is going to be awkward to fit in here. So yeah, sometimes there are some like things that we have, parameters that we have to work, within. And so it's really about like still finding a way to make it feel like it's ours with those parameters. And if we can't, then we're probably being too stringent with those parameters. And we probably need to find a freer template or just drop the template, because maybe I have to do that kind of writing to make an income, but then I should still do some writing for myself that's completely free form, right?
Yeah.
So, and if I have to if I'm getting paid to just write haikus all the time, maybe I want to just break off and write an entire page,
Yeah. So it's finding that mix, that balance of the need and the want.
If it deadens you on the inside, if it feels like it's like kind of deadening, gives you that dead feeling, then that's a good cue that this is probably not great. And you probably need to bust out of that template, or you need to find a way to creatively express yourself outside of that template, even if it's just for yourself. Right. Mm-hmm. And then I would say that, if you really think about the last one, so the last kind of step is really just about, it's more about that freedom. And it's more about understanding where those invisible fences are for you, those old storylines that are limiting you and holding you back. And it's setting yourself free from them. Now, one of the best and easiest ways that I can tell you to do this is, imagine if I were, able to give you 3 guarantees that you could do something and it would be completely 100% successful. Right. And let's say it wasn't a once in a lifetime, genie in a bottle thing, that I gave it to you every 6 months. Right. So don't think too big. Just think about okay, every 6 months, Hailey's going to give me, which by the way, I'd be making buku bucks if I had those to hand out.
Right. I'm like, nice. Yes.
But if I gave you 100% guarantee, 3 of those every 6 months, that whatever you did, you would be successful at, or that everyone would love it, or that you couldn't fail. Right? Yeah. What would you use those on?
Oh my gosh, I'd publish my books. for the first at least 2, I think I'd publish a book. Third one, photography book, coffee table book.
That's how you understand where your invisible fences are. And that's how you bust through them, is you pretend you have one of those magic slips, those permission slips, those 100% guarantees, which no one in life can give us those. Mm-hmm. But if we pretend that we have them, then we'll end up doing a lot more cool and interesting and adventurous and creative stuff.
I love that. I feel like that's a good way to kind of look at life and thinking okay, let's, maybe instead of what do we say? Every 6 months. Yeah. I mean, every 6 months, pretend that you have 3 freebies that you're gonna be successful in, no matter what would those 3 things be, and then kind of make those your goals to achieve in that 6 months.
Yeah. Another way you can do it is you can pretend, and this is like a little bit of a depressing theory, but like the simulation theory, pretend it's just a simulation, right? Life is just a big simulation. And then you're like, oh, well, it doesn't really matter. So you kind of develop what I call the F it mentality, where you're like, oh, right? Or, let's say that like you got diagnosed with like, I don't know, some kind of terminal disease, God forbid, knock on wood, that never happened. If it would put a lot of things into like very clear perspective. You wouldn't worry about failure or rejection or who said what about your art. You would be like, F it, I'm going to do it, So it's really just about finding ways to get over your fear and insecurity and imposter syndrome and do the thing that you were scared to do. Because remember, imposter syndrome is about shame and it's about fear. And courage is about doing it anyway, even when you're afraid and ashamed. So you can still have shame and fear and be brave. In fact, you can't be brave or courageous if you're never scared or ashamed, because then there would be nothing to actually, be brave about.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, Hailey. So much good information in this episode. You've already given us an insane amount of information and some wonderful steps on how to kind of like, I'll just bundle it all and say like reframe how we look at imposter syndrome. Do you have any kind of like final words of advice or encouragement for our listeners that might be dealing with imposter syndrome?
Yeah, I would just remind everybody, like I said earlier on in this podcast, that you might believe or have told yourself in your mind that you won't feel like an imposter if or when. But I can tell you, having worked with the people that are on the other side of all those ifs and whens, that are making the 6 figures or the 7 figures or the 8 figures, that have started their companies, that have been wildly successful, they are still struggling with it. That's not the way to overcome it. You cannot, no matter how many degrees you get, no matter how much money you make, no matter how much success or critical acclaim you get as an artist, that is not going to be the way that you overcome imposter syndrome. You've got to go inward and you have to befriend this inner imposter, and you have to learn how to bypass it, right? And tap into a different part. The different part is the creative part. The creative part is the free part of you, right? And the imposter and the critic kind of go hand in hand. They're always trying to keep this free part of you safe. They're actually scared of this creative part of you, right? So why would, this like inner critic, this inner imposter be scared of this part of you that is wild and free and creative? It's because that is a stronger part of you. So never forget that is your stronger part. The more you tap into that, the more that you really sink into that and let that part shine through and let your art come from there, the more that the imposter is going to kind of shrink into the background, right? And not become such a oppressive force in your life, in your career, and in your art.
As we start to wrap up, is there anything that you're currently working on or that you have out there that you'd like to share with the listeners?
Absolutely. So I'm, always writing new things. You can feel free to follow me on LinkedIn. I post a lot of articles on there. It's Hailey Shafir, HaileyShafir. And I also have this new business, Indie Wind, which is still in its very infant stages, but I do have an Etsy store. And I post some of the silk wrap skirts that I make in the fairy terrarium gardens, which are also like little vision boards there. And I'm also going to send out to Allie some links to articles on some of the things that we've talked about today, like shame and imposter syndrome and things like that, just for you guys as listeners to have as a resource.
Amazing. And I will definitely include all the links that Hailey provides, as well as her LinkedIn and Etsy shop links, so that you will be able to find them quick and easy. They will be in the episode description. And I mean, Hailey, I really can't thank you enough for being on the episode. And I do think we will be doing another episode in the future on a similar topic, if I'm remembering correctly. I'm trying to remember what we were working on, but I really can't thank you enough for being on and for sharing and just like really breaking down imposter syndrome and how we can kind of work through it. Like, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Allie. And I look forward to having another resin night soon.
Yes, we can destroy some more tables.
Yes, definitely.
And with that, I'd also like to thank the listeners for tuning in to today's episode. If you have questions or comments for myself or for any of my guests, including Hailey, you can text or call us on our hotline 252-419-6004, and we will answer your questions on a future episode of the podcast. Be sure to like, rate, and review the podcast, and you can follow us on Instagram at wandering_creative_, or you can visit our website, cootscreations.com.
This has been a Coots Creations production. Follow the show on Instagram at wandering_creative_ and on Twitter at wandering_pod. For more information, go to cootscreations.com. Like, rate, review, and subscribe. To sponsor the Wandering Creatives podcast, visit www.cootscreations.com/podcast-sponsorship-opportunities. You can also click the link in the episode description below. To be a guest or a featured maker on the podcast, click the link in our Instagram bio or contact us at cootscreationsllc@gmail.com.